Hi, boys and girls, it's Miss Cooper, and today I'm going to share a special Thanksgiving story with you called Balloons Over Broadway. It is the true story of the puppeteer of the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade. And on the front cover is a picture of who this story is about, Anthony Tony Frederick Sarg. There's a picture of him, and we're going to learn more about how he started the Thanksgiving parade with the balloons. From the time he was a little boy, Tony Sarg loved to figure out how to make things move. He once said he became a marionette man when he was only 6 years old. And a marionette is a type of puppet that you use by moving strings up and down. His father had asked him to feed their chickens at 6:30 in the morning every day. Tony had an idea. What if he could feed the chickens without leaving his bed? That would be fabulous, wouldn't it? The next morning, Tony pulled on the rope and the door to the chicken coop opened. The chickens ate their breakfast. Tony stayed snug in his bed, and his dad, so impressed, never made Tony do another chore. So if you look, he has a plan that he made. This is like when we're doing STEM projects. We make our plan first. So he made a plan on how to make that happen. When Tony grew up, he moved to London, where he discovered that no one was making marionettes for kids anymore. So out of wood, cloth, and strings, Tony began to make puppets. He figured out ways to make his marionettes movements so lifelike that they performed as if they were real actors. Word soon spread about Tony's amazing marionettes. When Tony moved to New York City, the Tony Sarg marionettes began performing on Broadway. So there he is, going on Broadway, and that building shows that's where his studio was. In the heart of New York City, in Herald Square, was the biggest store on earth, R.H. Macy's department store. Macy's had heard about Tony's puppets and asked him to design a puppet parade for the store's holiday windows. So Tony made new puppets based on storybook characters. Then he attached them to gears and pulleys to make them move. So here's Humpty Dumpty and what he did to make them move. Lots of planning, and I'm sure lots of practice and error. I'm sure it didn't work the first time. Macy's Wondertown. In Macy's Wondertown windows, Tony's mechanical marionettes danced across the stage as if by magic. All day long they performed to shoppers jostling for a better look. But Macy's had an even bigger job in the store for Tony. Many of the people working at Macy's were immigrants, and as the holidays approached, they missed their own holiday traditions of music and dancing in the streets. Macy's agreed to put on a parade for their employees, and they hired Tony to help. Tony, too, was an immigrant, so he loved the idea of creating a parade based on street carnivals from all over the world. He made costumes and built horse-drawn floats, and Macy's even arranged to bring in bears, elephants, and camels from the Central Park Zoo. And an immigrant is someone who comes to another country. And that's one of the things that is great about the United States. We're a free country. And so a lot of people like to come here because they don't have rulers that tell them things that they have to do. The animals joined hundreds of Macy's employees on Thanksgiving Day, 1924. Winding their way from Harlem to Herald Square, it was a dazzling parade. In fact, Macy's first parade was such a success that they decided to have one every year on Thanksgiving Day to celebrate America's own holiday. So there's that big parade. And you can see some of his balloons that he created. I love watching the Thanksgiving Day parade on TV. Each year, the parade grew, but when Macy's brought in lions and tigers, in addition to the bears, elephants, and camels, the animals roared and growled and frightened some of the children. And it says, Tony, can you think of something spectacular? Asked R.H. Macy. So he asked him something to replace the animals. And you know what Tony said? Okay. He knew he could think of something. That's that growth mindset, right? Thinking and believing in yourself. Tony hoped to replace the animals with some kind of puppets, but his marionettes were less than 3 feet tall. He would have to make much larger puppets in order for them to be seen in the parade. And how could he make them strong enough to hold up in bad weather, yet light enough to move up and down the streets? Tony knew of a company in Ohio that made blimps out of rubber, the perfect material for any weather. When he called the company and showed them his sketches, they agreed to make what Tony wanted. Still, how would Tony make his big puppets move? So he has a picture of the blimp, and it says construct using simple shapes glued together. And here he has something that looks like a caterpillar. It says decorative legs will be made from fabric and attached last. Then Tony had an idea from an Indonesian rod puppet, like in his collection. So this is a rod puppet where they have 2 rods coming down from the puppet. Oh, and here's the balloons put to life. On Thanksgiving Day, Tony's creatures, some as high as 16 feet, spilled into the streets, and the crowds cheered wildly. Part puppet, part balloon, the air-filled rubber bags wobbled down the avenues, propped up by wooden sticks. So, here they are going down the street on those sticks. But now the sidewalks were so packed with people that only those in the first few rows could really see the parade. Tony realized his puppets would have to be even bigger and higher off the ground. And though the sticks helped to steer the puppets, they were stiff and heavy. Tony wanted his balloons to articulate, to move and gesture more like puppets. But how? With a marionette, the controls are above and the puppets hang down. So there's what a marionette puppet looks like. So they control them from the top, moving the strings and that wooden cross. So he had an idea. But what if the controls were below the puppet and could rise up? So underneath them. During the next year, Tony set his idea into motion. This time he asked the company in Ohio to make balloons out of rubberized silk, as strong as rubber but lighter than rubber alone. Most important, Tony ordered the balloons to be filled not just with air but with helium too. Since helium is lighter than air, it would make the balloons rise. Once the puppets were completed, they were deflated and shipped back to Tony in New York. Tony did not know if everything would go as planned. What if the balloons are filled with too much helium? What if one hits a sharp object? Will they fit under the L, which is the elevated train track that runs through New York City? It was still dark on Thanksgiving morning when Tony filled the balloons with helium, tethering them down with sandbags. But by 1 p.m., the sidewalks were packed with people ready for the parade. Then one by one, Tony cut the lines to the sandbags. Let's have a parade. I love this picture in the book. It says, and the magnificent upside-down marionettes rose to the skies. And this is a really tall picture. I'm going to show you all of it down at the bottom. Nodding and waving to the crowds below, they sailed past Central Park. They sailed down Broadway. They shimmered and swayed through the canyons of New York City. So there's all of those big balloons on the strings underneath them. So his idea worked. High above the crowds, they flounced in the afternoon wind, pulling the rope handlers this way and that. Yet every heave-ho, the balloons gestured and articulated like wild puppets, and the crowd screamed for more. After the balloons were eased under the L, they ended in front of the Macy's. at Tony's Wondertown windows. It was a parade New Yorkers would never forget. And from that day on, every Thanksgiving morning, crowds have lined the sidewalks of New York City to see what new balloons will rise from the skies for Macy's famous parade. Tony Sarg, the puppeteer who loved to figure out how to make things move, had set the stage with a little rigging for a puppet to be anything anyone could imagine it to be. So all it takes is a dream and an idea. And then, Miss Cooper, I love books that are true. And it says, I have never done a stroke of work in my life, said Tony Sarg. Tony Sarg's helium-filled balloons debuted, that means that was the first time ever, in the Macy's 1928 Thanksgiving Day Parade. Balloons have risen ever since then, with the exception of 2 years during World War II when rubber and helium were needed in the war efforts. Tony continued to work on the parade for many years, later collaborating with Walt Disney on the character balloons. Today, more than 40 million people worldwide watch the parade, which is still imbued with the wit and humor of Tony Sarg. Tony's daughters, Mary, once remarked, quite simply, Tony Sarg just never grew up. When he began making puppets, he relied on his childhood love of tinkering and figuring out how things worked. He taught himself how to carve wood, build sets, sew costumes, engineer electronics, and write plays. He had a keen attention to detail and made innovations to performing puppetry. Many consider Tony Sarg to be the father of American puppetry, but Tony could not have accomplished all he did without his talented apprentices, some of whom went on to their own fame. One of the apprentices, Bill Baird, later created the puppets for the Lonely Gothard marionette show featured in the movie The Sound of Music. Even with no formal art lessons, Tony became one of the busiest artists of the day. But whether he was illustrating his children's books, designing toys, creating animations, or managing his marionettes, Tony still made time for children. They were his favorite audience. He responded to every letter he received, one of which was simply addressed, Tony Sarg, N.Y. So, and there's a picture of Tony with one of the balloons he created. So, and we still get to enjoy the fact that Tony created those balloons, those big marionette puppets made out of rubber and helium. And every Thanksgiving, Macy's has a Thanksgiving Day parade that is televised on TV. So I hope this Thanksgiving you'll check it out on Thanksgiving Day and maybe type to me and tell me what puppets you see. We're going to do an escape room later today, which is on Tuesday, and I hope you can join us for that. I think it'll be a lot of fun, and you'll learn a little bit more about Tony Sarg and the puppets. Also, be sure to go and check on your science link and watch a little bit of last year's parade and the balloons that were featured there. Thanks, and have a good day.